What is the future of fantasy television? In the history of American media, different genres have momentarily held the country's attention. Noirs, westerns, and most recently, superhero movies. All three of these genres in some way captured the American psyche of their time, with noirs displaying the country's moral uncertainty following World War II, westerns looking back to cement a cultural mythology, and superhero movies showcasing American individualism and exceptionalism. But for years now, the superhero genre has been in decline, with oversaturation of Marvel projects in recent years choking the life out of the once thriving genre. So, what will rise in its place? For years, I've been saying that the next big genre is fantasy. This has already become apparent in the world of television, starting with the dominance of Game of Thrones, and with television supplanting movies as the main way most people get their entertainment, I think that shift has already started. But why fantasy? Like I said, every big genre signifies something about its time period. Superhero movies are certainly fantastical, but they are still firmly placed in the real world. Nerdy for sure, but still accessible to middle America. Fantasy, on the other hand, is pure escapism, and more than ever, I think that's what people want. Superhero movies are also a display of excess, with massive budgets going towards heavy stunts and effects, haphazardly deploying action set pieces the same way Bollywood films use musical numbers. But nothing is more expensive than fantasy, which requires the same elements while adding on the massive production hurdles of crafting an entire fake world through sets, wardrobe, and props. What I'm saying is, they're a flex, a way for studios and streamers to distinguish themselves, like Amazon pouring $1 billion into the Rings of Power. But there is a problem with my hypothesis, because, like superhero movies, fantasy has hit a bit of a stall lately. Since Thrones hit the peak of its popularity around the middle of its run, all anyone could talk about was the next Game of Thrones. So, have we gotten the next Game of Thrones? Since the descent of Thrones from its place of cultural preeminence, as I touched on in a previous video, we've had its successor, House of the Dragon, the latest season of which has been met with mixed reviews. There was The Witcher, which momentarily held the cultural spotlight, but has been declining in relevancy ever since, most recently losing Henry Cavill as its lead. The Wheel of Time, which I will get back to, and The Rings of Power, which is It's not great, I'll come back to that too. If you're counting sci-fi fantasy, the cancellation of The Acolyte, paired with the announcement of The Mandalorian and Grogu, represents Disney's new trend of barely treading water when it comes to cultural relevancy. So what happens now? Where do we go from here? For the last couple of years, I've been reading fantasy as a pastime, and I have some ideas for where the genre could go and what the next big thing could be. We'll begin with the pre-established franchises, but first, I would like to introduce an idea, and that is that world building is not an unlimited resource. More and more companies have come to believe that fantasy works are like these infinite wells that you can keep going back to over and over again, but that isn't true. Good world building is like potential energy, and the best stories, the truly great ones, use all of it. What I mean is, when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, he took the most important ideas and places in Middle-earth, the most interesting moment in time in the history of the whole fictional world, with the greatest density of conflict and thematic weight, and he told that story. The world he built was meant for that story. Middle-earth may have begun with The Hobbit, but it reached its apex with The Lord of the Rings. And sure, there might have been a few crumbs of interesting lore left, enough for some short stories and a sort of dry history text, but there will never be another story set in Middle-earth that will surpass The Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power is fanfiction, and it's not very good. There are good crumbs. Personally, I like the character of Adar and what he represents for the orcs, but otherwise I don't think there's much there narratively. The War for the Rohirrim animated film promises to unite the passions of both insufferable Lord of the Rings movie fans and insufferable anime fans, which at least someone's getting what they want. There is The Hunt for Gollum, the upcoming live-action film, which, despite the talent involved and the fact that it revolves around one of my favorite characters of all time, is stupid. I don't have much hope for the Tolkien expanded universe. So what about the Song of Ice and Fire Game of Thrones expanded universe? How is that going to fare? Well, we're apparently going to be seeing a lot more of it, with 3 live-action and 3 animated shows promised. So, what crumbs has George R. R. Martin left out? There's Fire and Blood, a fictional history book told from differing perspectives tracing the Targaryen family line, which is already being adapted into House of the Dragon, a show that has struggled recently with a second season that was unnaturally shortened by the network and budget cuts apparently. Then there's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, based on George R. R. Martin's Dunk and Egg stories. I have hope for this since it is drawing directly from the author's work, but I don't know if it'll be a smash hit because it doesn't have the epic quality of the original series or the Dance of Dragons storyline. As for the other shows, I'm worried they'll end up like Blood Moon, the Game of Thrones spin-off you may or may not have heard of, which was canned after the pilot. The writers apparently struggled on account of not having enough source material to work with, which is seemingly the same reason the Jon Snow show fell through. Speaking of cancelled pilots, there was the Dark Tower pilot Amazon ordered, which was cancelled and its budget cannibalized because it quote-unquote wasn't on par with their other fantasy prospects, The Wheel of Time and The Rings of Power, which both turned out so great. The Dark Tower by Stephen King is my favorite book series of all time, and Wizard and Glass would have been the perfect book to adapt for TV, which was the plan. The series itself is, we'll just say winding, but Wizard and Glass tells a prequel story set in a single location with a set cast of characters, which would have made for a great season of television. The images they released from the pilot looked amazing, like way better than the awful 2017 film. Mike Flanagan has said he intends to make a Dark Tower show, but when that will materialize is anyone's guess. Will it be the next Game of Thrones? Probably not. The Dark Tower is too weird, at least if you want to do it justice, which I would if I made it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Mike Flanagan is probably the best choice, having adapted King before, but it should be mine. Give it to me. Let me make it. Please. So what about the show that sucked the life out of my dream project? Wheel of Time. Well, I watched the first season of The Wheel of Time and thought it was alright, with a weak ending due to budget and COVID restrictions. Then I read the first 2 books of The Wheel of Time, went back, rewatched it, and realized it's dog shit. It's so bad. I mean, one of my friends walked in on me watching the first episode and he thought it was some kind of joke video because the editing was so awful. It is a horrible adaptation, losing all of the book's best ideas in favor of flaccid melodrama. The Witcher is a show that exists. Good luck, Liam. There's Shadow and Bone, which suffered from the sadly terminal condition of being on Netflix. So what's next? What depths are there left to plumb? What graves left to be plundered? I have my own suggestions. Most recently, I've been reading the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss and the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. Currently, a Kingkiller Chronicle adaptation is lost in production hell, but does the source material have the qualities that make a great TV show? The next Game of Thrones, if you will. The Kingkiller Chronicles has a very unique structure, bouncing back and forth between the present and past as the main character recounts the story of his life. Patrick Rothfuss has a tendency to focus on the mundane, forgoing epic plot points in favor of the everyday realities of staying above the poverty line. It's basically Harry Potter if Harry's parents didn't leave him all the gold at the beginning, with the main character Quoth having to constantly work odd jobs and put himself into debt to keep his tuition at magic school paid. It's a very nuanced, musical, and sensory work with a lot of deeper complexity, and it would require a lot of care to adapt it, especially with the final book of the series, The Doors of Stone, still forthcoming. It would be very easy to get bogged down in narration or for the showrunner to get carried away trying to make it more exciting. On the flip side, I think you could take the first book of the Stormlight Archives, The Way of Kings, and literally just put exactly what is on the page into script form, and it would work perfectly. Cards on the Table, in the last few years, this is my favorite fantasy novel that I've read. And not just because it happens to perfectly fit all of my niche literary preferences. Okay, maybe that is why. But it has themes, ideas, notions, concepts. It's like I was saying before, all of the world building in this book is built up to perfectly support the greater themes of the story. Themes of violence, overcoming despair, helping versus hurting others, and what leaders owe to their people. Instead of a party of characters going on a quest to stop the Hermleglurbaderb, it tells the story of a group of disconnected characters caught up in different facets of an unsolvable political problem. Added benefit, you won't get the usual people griping about inserting people of color, because the book has actual people of color who are just already there. And like George R. R. Martin's characters, the characters in The Way of Kings are underdogs who have to overcome societal barriers, and it even has characters who experience mental illness and physical disadvantages as well. Not to mention mind-bending action scenes, including a character who can literally control gravitational forces. If any story could be the next Game of Thrones, it is the Stormlight Archives. And that's all I have to say. Do it, you cowards. You bet you won't. Fucking Netflix, Amazon,